Okay, good afternoon, everybody. This is Gaurav Tandon here, your host for the webinar today. Just a quick introduction. So I work as the Azure Sales Lead or the BDM for Microsoft Azure within the Ingram Micro Cloud team. And we have got Robert Crane, who is a certified expert on Microsoft technologies from the last 20 years. He's been certified on Azure, Office 365, SBS, back in the 2011 days as well. And he's the most valuable player from Microsoft who will be delivering this webinar today. This is one of the webinars from our Cloud Elevate series where we'll be talking about the migration of the SBS Small Business Server to Azure. And if you can just have a look at the So this is what we have as a part of the agenda today. So I did the introductions, and what we'll be covering is actually some of the considerations that the resellers need to take before they actually start their migration journey. We know that each of the scenarios and each of the situations is going to be different in terms of this migration. So Rob will be taking us towards through a lot of through best practices on what they should be following up when they start on this journey. He'll be talking about a migration framework, in terms of what they should follow in terms of different components of the Azure infrastructure, and then also in terms of recommendations of moving some of those workloads like files to SharePoint and Teams as well. And then I'll be covering at the end of the session about the Ingram Micro's Azure Accelerate program and some of the incentives that we're running till the end of June for this year. One request from my end would be that, since we have got a lot to cover and SBS to Azure migration has got multiple scenarios, and every deployment is going to be unique and different. There's going to be a lot of content which has to be covered by Rob in this session today. So we might not have time to take the questions. What I would suggest that each one of you can actually send the list of your questions separately to me and to Ashna, and then we will try and get back to each one of you in terms of answering those questions and helping you in this journey. So from here, I'll hand this over to Rob to take this over, and yeah, all yours, Rob.
Okay, so I don't seem to have the slide control, so can you move down a slide for me, please?
Yeah.
Okay, so basically the way we want to kick off things here is the fact that we need to have a baseline of the environment that we've got. So typically what we see in an on-prem environment is that we have something like a SBS server that has a local AD, that has email, that has potentially SharePoint files, maybe SQL is in there as well. It's backing up maybe to an external USB drive, and it connects via typically a consumer grade router to the cloud. Now, what's happened here is that you need to appreciate that obviously we're looking at a system which is now approaching 9 to 10 years of age. It certainly did the job well at the time, but the technologies have moved on. What we find is that many customers are probably looking to replace this equipment at some stage. And again, what happens in the case of failure? When they look to replace it, they want to ensure that they don't want to buy additional hardware. So they're not looking to purchase additional infrastructure on-prem. They're looking to migrate into the cloud to give them that flexibility and typically to move away from having computers, servers and that on their location. So again, if that's our baseline, we've typically got an SBS environment. It's composed of a number of different components, typically all on the same box, and we want to look at moving that to a cloud-based environment, in this case being Azure. So let's see if I've got keyboard control. Okay, so some caveats we need to have a look at here. Now, every single installation is going to be slightly different given its age. The older it gets, the more non-standard it becomes. So there will be different levels of patching, there will be different levels of applications. Some environments may have a terminal server, some environments may have a app server, different versions of SQL. So again, we need to consider that there are a lot of customizations, a lot of differences. At its core, yes, we have SBS, but again, these systems are quite ancient now. And again, we need to approach them in a unique, with a framework, and apply that as makes sense to each situation. Now, what I'm trying to do here is just show you the possibilities. We just haven't got enough time to give you all the options that are available here or look at all the potential solutions that can be provided. So what we're providing here is Azure is as a toolbox. So Azure is your infrastructure toolbox that will allow you to run up virtual machines, to move files, to do backups, to do a range of things all inside a single subscription, which you can then grow. You can also integrate with hybrid. But again, there are many different ways to achieve the end result here. There is not necessarily one single path up the mountain here. However, again, you have the range of tools to provide the solutions, and that gives you the flexibility to solve the problems in each unique location. Now, the other thing here to remember is you don't have to do this all. Many cases, hybrid is going to be the way that suits most customers for a period of time. You don't have to go in on a Friday night and cut over to a complete cloud solution by Monday morning. We've all been through SBS migration, so from 2003 to 2008 and into 2011. And typically what would happen is you would walk in, like I said, on a Friday afternoon when the rest of the staff are leaving, and then Monday morning you'd expect to be in there having everything up and operational and to answer all the questions. So again, we want to do this in a stage way, something that makes sense, that has the flexibility, that gives us the ability to provision things as required with the ability to grow and accelerate or, again, delay things as required. So remember, there is no necessity to do everything or anything that I've mentioned here immediately. Okay. And again, you don't have to do it all tomorrow, as I mentioned. So you don't have to do all of this, so you can pick and choose what makes sense, and you don't have to run out and do it immediately tomorrow. As I mentioned, every option is going to have multiple solutions. How you back things up, how you do VPNs, how you do your machine migrations are lots of options. So in Azure, for example, you could migrate all the SBS roles into individual VMs in Azure if you wanted to. So you have a VM for AD, a VM for Exchange, a VM for SharePoint. That's one solution. Another solution may be to look at using Exchange Online, using SharePoint and then SMB files, all right? So again, there are lots of different ways to solve this, and I would suggest to you in many cases, it's not going to be the end journey. So maybe you want to move the infrastructure into Azure IaaS, so infrastructure as a service, but down the track, you want to move it to platform as a service so that you don't have to worry about patching and updating VMs. So again, remember there are multiple ways to solve issues here. And the biggest thing here is that you're going to have the skill and experience to work with these things. So Azure, like Microsoft 365, is a constantly evolving product, adding additional features, adding additional functionality, and to be able to implement this effectively means that you'll need to, again, have the skills to be able to be comfortable with this and to implement this on a regular basis. Now, some of these key skills, especially in the cloud world today, are things like understanding identity, PowerShell, scripting. Those sort of things are key skills that need to obviously be attained and then improved over time. So remember, there is a lot of familiarity with the technologies like TCP/IP, networking, domains, all that sort of stuff still does apply. But again, how do we apply that into the modern cloud world in Microsoft? That is the knowledge that most people will need to add to their tool bag so that they can, again, give the appropriate solutions here. All right, let's try and go down a slide. So as with everything, please appreciate that SBS is now effectively a 10-year-old technology, all right? There are things that it can't and shouldn't do. So one of the big caveats is that SBS only supports PowerShell version 2. If you put a more modern version of PowerShell on your SBS, yes, it will install. Yes, it will update what's there, but yes, it will also break a lot of things. It will break the wizards. So the wizards in SBS depend on PowerShell version 2. You don't want to have to try and roll back from version 3 or version 5 back to version 2, right? So one of the limitations, one of the things, or one of the aims in the framework here, I would suggest to you is you really don't want to touch anything on that SBS box. You really want to leave that exactly as it is, with no additional software, with no additional configuration, because what we're going to find here is that things like SBS also need to hold the infrastructure roles. So these are roles that determine that this is the main server in the environment. Now, SBS will support a second domain controller, but it cannot typically have the infrastructure roles on it. So again, remember that we have a box that is a domain controller, the primary domain controller with the infrastructure roles that at some point in time, if you are migrating away from this, those roles will have to be moved to another box. When you do move those roles, then SBS basically will start a countdown timer. And again, that will mean that you'll have to replace that SBS box as soon as possible once that countdown has started. Now, one of the other key things to point out here is that the connectivity that allows you to synchronize identities up to Azure, which is a piece of software called Azure AD Connect, that is not supported on SBS. Yes, it is supported on a modern domain controller, so you can install it on 2012, 2016, 2019 standalone servers, but Azure AD Connect is not supported on SBS. One of the many reasons is, again, it uses PowerShell version 5 to install. You'll also have an SQL database which isn't compatible with SBS. So please be aware that Azure AD Connect is not supported on SBS. This means that to do a synchronization, if you choose to go down that route, you will need to look at having a member server to give you that ability to install the Azure AD Connect software on it. Now, the other thing I'll note here is typically the SBS installs, being now 9 or 10 years old, are pretty brittle, especially if you've inherited them over time. Now, one of the considerations you need to make is that perhaps if you've owned that SBS, you installed it from day dot and grew up with it, you've maintained it its whole life, then basically I think that that is a good base to look at moving, migrating, doing hybrid. If you have an SBS installation that you've inherited over time, this may also be a good opportunity to start a new clean domain, to start from scratch, to say, look, we want to own everything from end to end. We want to know exactly what the history of this system is. We've maintained the SBS as is for this period of time, but we would like to start with our own best practices on top. So again, that's a consideration to make. We've also got the fact of brittle hardware. So again, the hardware that the SBS box lives on is typically outdated. It can't be easily replaced if parts are required. And again, you've got to balance up. The fact is, if there is a failure, so if there's a motherboard failure on the server in which SBS is running, that effectively means that server is down, would need to be completely replaced on-prem if that was the case. New server, new drives, ordering, all that sort of stuff. We don't want to go down that route. So again, we want to give ourselves the flexibility, but again, appreciate that most of these systems are 10 plus years old. Hardware and software, and even the configuration, can be very brittle at times. Now, another big caveat to remember is that typically SBS 2011 is running Windows Server 2008 R2. And remember, that is shortly up for basically obsolescence. So Microsoft will no longer be providing security updates and support on that operating system. So this is another good reason to look at migrating away from this environment, because again, it just becomes harder and harder to support, harder and harder to get working, harder and harder to install current modern software on there. So again, remember that we're looking at very old systems here. And the big caveat again is, if you have issues, if you need support, call up Microsoft. Basically, it's an unsupported system. Fewer and fewer people out there basically have experience with SBS because, again, like I said, of its age. Now, one of the key things to remember here is that when you set up Microsoft 365 and Office 365, you actually get a free Azure tenant. Now, inside that Azure tenant, you get a Azure AD subscription. So this Azure AD subscription, which is free, allows you to do your identities for your users and tie them in so that they can access services in the cloud. Now, what you should do, I recommend, is to add a paid Azure subscription into the existing subscription that was configured when you got Microsoft 365. This paid subscription will then give you the ability to run up virtual machines, backup, storage, and add all the Azure functionality in that you required. All right. So again, when you start any Microsoft 365 tenant, you will get an Azure tenant under the covers. Just add the paid subscription in there so that then you can expand out as required. Now, the good thing here to remember is that basically the subscription that you provide in Azure is a consumption-based subscription. this means that you aren't billed, or the customer isn't billed until they start using it. So there is no reason not to push an Azure subscription in there immediately during or before a migration, so it's there ready to go. It will not cost you or the customer anything until you start using Azure resources. Having it in there gives you that flexibility to call on that immediately as required. So my recommendation would be is that for every Microsoft 365 tenant that you sell, add an Azure subscription in there. Even if you never use it, it's there ready to go and gives you that flexibility, that toolbox to start swinging things across if required. Now, the first place to start, I would suggest when talking about a migration, is backing things up. So what we want to be able to do is we want to use Azure File Backup. So Azure File Backup allows us to target files via an agent on a server that can then be targeted and backed up to the cloud. Now remember that this agent, again, is modern software, typically uses a modern version of PowerShell. We can't install this directly on our SBS box, but again, if we have a member server or we have a NAS device which has our files on it, we can look at targeting that and backing that up into the Azure cloud. So the easiest way to do this, again, is simply put an agent from Azure File Backup, target the location in Azure, and we can start backing up data, files and folder data directly into the cloud. Now, this Azure File Backup doesn't do applications like running databases, Exchange on-prem or SharePoint. We do have an option for that. This is aimed at purely files. So if you have an environment where you need to back up files to the cloud rather than local USB drives, again, have a look at Azure Backup. Now, a little bit hard to see here because I wanted to get the prices in, but basically what I've done here is given you an indication of the costing in this. Now, one of the, I think the fallacies out there is that Azure is expensive. So again, for what it does, when you configure it correctly and price it appropriately, it is a very cost-effective solution. So in this case, if we're looking to back up 100 gigabytes of data, we want that to be locally redundant. So locally redundant means there'll be 3 copies in the data center. We also have a retention range there as well, which you can see. So again, that's adding up for 100 gig of data. Basically, it's going to cost us $20 odd a month, right? So again, this is a really good option for people who want to have that retention, who want to have that data backed up to the cloud that they can retrieve and again, replicate in a number of off-site locations. Now, locally redundant storage, you can also improve that or increase that to globally redundant or zone redundant. So again, there are more backups held in more Microsoft data centers. But the basic solution here is to do just locally redundant within a single data center. But if the customer wants, you can offer them a premium service where they use globally redundant to, again, replicate that in multiple centers throughout the Azure regions. Now, I mentioned that the Azure File Backup is aimed at just doing files. Now, Azure does have a solution that does application backups. Now, application backups will do files and folders, they will do network shares, and they will also do running applications like on-prem Exchange, on-prem SharePoint, and SQL. So basically, again, the way that this works is that you require a backup console because, again, the software being modern, we can't put it in an SBS box. So you would need a local member server, for example, put the application backup software, which comes from Azure for free, and then you can then use that to target resources within your network, whether that's on SBS or on other servers. That can then be backed up locally to a local cache and then backed up to the cloud. So the Azure application backup gives us the advantage of doing files, but also doing running applications, databases, and so on, and backing that up to the cloud. All right. So this uses the Microsoft DPM, Data Protection Manager service. And again, that's a very, very detailed and enterprise-grade backup solution. And we can certainly use that to target resources. But because of the limitation of our SBS box and the software, we typically need to use an external backup console. Now, the way that you can approach this need to have an external console is if the client's looking to migrate completely to the cloud or, again, moving in a hybrid, maybe what you can do is rent them an on-prem server to achieve the backup console plus a number of other things that we'll nominate, but you could perhaps rent that to them for a period of time. Or the other option we can do here is we could potentially have this backup console actually running as a virtual machine inside Azure. So we'll come to how to do that. But again, the simplest way would be to get a member server, put on the backup console software, target the resources with an SBS, and then back those up across the internet to a location in Azure that you've set up. Now, again, there is a slight difference here in the cost because we're backing up the application. In this case, what I've done is I've increased the number of instances to 3. So there's 300 gigabytes worth of data being backed up here. So imagine 3 independent servers maybe, or 3 things that you want kept separate. You'll see again that the cost is around, from what I can see, is around $70 odd. So again, you've added basically 3 times the capacity for your backups, and your cost per month is still basically under $100. And again, you've got options there on retention, you've got redundancy options, and it's a matter of working out what the flexibility and giving you the price options for the customer. But Azure Backup for applications, like I said, we'll do files and folders, network shares, as well as running applications like Exchange and SharePoint. Now, the third type of backup that is available to us in Azure is something called site recovery. So this is based on the Hyper-V replication, which is tried and true Windows Server technology. So if you have a box which is basically a hypervised box running your guest OSs in, then what you can do is you can effectively put an agent on the host there, and then the guests can be replicated into Azure. They can also be replicated to another site, another data center if you want it, but typically we select the N solution here, the one on the most right, where we take a replication of an on-prem environment, we replicate that up into Azure. So what we see is identical machines, a hot spare if you want, of a server running in the background. Now, the advantage to that is that this can be set up as a DR, which means that if the on-prem environment fails for some reason, the Azure backup in the cloud can spin up to take its place, or we can also use site recovery as a way to migrate from our on-prem into the cloud. So we can target a machine, a guest on a Hyper-V host, we can replicate that up into Azure. When we're ready, we can then basically break that replication and make the one in the Azure environment the primary. Now, again, the costs to do this are very cheap. So you'll see here, again, that what we want to do is we want to basically have the recovery to Azure. So the top option is recovering to a customer site, to your own data center. But in this case, I'm going to basically set up one server that I want to recover to Azure. So you see the cost of doing that basically is around about $30. We would have to pay some additional cost there for storage, but because it's backup storage, right? So recovery vaults and backups are cheaper when it comes to storage because they are used for backup. Again, it's going to be quite cheap. So again, the actual replication service, the Azure Site Recovery Service, is about $34. So therefore, we can use that to replicate our servers to either provide immediate DR or to provide a migration. So one of the big issues I would suggest you think about is that what happens if that SBS on-prem box does have a total failure. Let's imagine that there's a total hardware failure that's a motherboard or something that can't easily be replaced. It means new hardware, a complete new server, and trying to get that SBS box up and running. So yes, you may have an image-based backup, but getting that into a new machine with new drivers is going to be very challenging. So potentially an option that you can provide is the ability to do a Hyper-V replication, to be replicating this as a DR into the cloud, so that if there's a failure on-prem, you do have the ability in Azure to either bring that down and replicate it back, or potentially, if you wanted to, again, run with that in the cloud. All right, so that gives you the flexibilities there. Now, what we need to do is we need to now start looking at things like, okay, we've backed up, we're comfortable with our backup, we've got some backups into the cloud. The next thing we want to start doing is, okay, how do we start moving some of these things like files and folders and emails? So in most cases, the thing that makes the most sense is going to be migrating Exchange email data into Office 365, Microsoft 365. So again, you're typically not going to set up an Exchange server as a VM in Azure and license it and connect everybody into that. Now, you certainly could do that, but the cost of setting up a standalone enterprise style Exchange server is going to be pretty prohibitive. So what we want to do is we want to move the workloads which make the most sense into services like Microsoft 365. So that's going to mean that our emails will typically move to Exchange Online. Some of our data, some of our file data will move into OneDrive and also SharePoint. So things like user profiles, their desktops, maybe even some archive data can be moved into SharePoint Online. We've also got Teams in there, so we can then start, again, breaking this up, make it easier for people to collaborate using all the features that are in there. And the reality is again, we don't have to move everything into Microsoft 365. Maybe we want to keep a traditional file server or some other third-party application. How do we actually go in and do that? But the first thing I think to think about, emails are pretty easy. I think most people would have emails already well under control with third-party tools or the options provided by Microsoft. The real challenge in any migration is going to be, how do we move files? Where do we want to move files? What makes sense? And I will tell you that in a lot of cases, you are going to have to transform the storage methodology that the customers use. So this is going to mean that some of the data in files is going to go into Teams. Some of the data is going to go into OneDrive. Some of the data into standalone SharePoint sites, and potentially some of the data and files may go in directly into something like Azure. So again, lots of options here. There's not one simple solution. It's a matter of determining what makes sense. So some of the benefits of using something like SharePoint are version control, check in, check out, the ability to, again, link with applications like Exchange Online. All right, so again, we get all these benefits, we get workflows, we get all this sort of power there, but for some files that may not make sense. So again, lots of options here in Microsoft 365 and in Azure. So here we go. So again, what we can do is we want to move the easy workloads like some file data, our Exchange, and probably our SharePoint. Now, typically, if they're using company web, that's a one-for-one move because we move from SharePoint on-prem into SharePoint in the cloud. Not a lot of customers generally use company web, but it is there as an option, and their file data can move into, like I said, SharePoint, Teams, and their individual data into OneDrive. All right, so that makes it nice and easy. Now, if we move Exchange, if we move our files, the majority of our files, we're typically going to be left with third-party applications and SQL databases. Now, again, one of the big challenges with an SBS or a smaller environment is that that version of SQL is probably going to be pretty ancient. It's probably going to be either a free version or a very old version. So again, how do we manage that? How do we plan that? And that SQL version is probably used for a third-party app which you don't control directly. You have a third party that comes in and manages and maintains that, and again is going to want to specify what the resources are that any new version of SQL will run on. But typically the files, the folders, the email, that sort of stuff we can move. Now here's an example of something in Azure that you can use to store files. So Azure has something called a storage account. Now a storage account can hold virtual machine hard disk, it can hold web data, but it can also be used to map to NTFS style file shares across the web. So we can run basically a command line option that will then connect a Z drive or whatever to a location in Azure, and it looks just like a file share, but it's a big USB disk in the sky. So you'll see that we can go into the calculator, we can choose the location, we can again choose our redundancy, we can choose how much data. So again, I've selected say 100 gig of data. And again, when we look at storage accounts, one of the things we need to factor in are operations, so read, write, and things like that. Again, this is one of the things that you certainly need to look at a rule of thumb about it, because again, it varies depending on how much information the customer uses. So again, rather than having one complete storage account, maybe you break it up into a number of small ones. Maybe you say, this storage account I'm going to create, I'm going to use that for archiving. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at all the files on the file server. We'll determine files that are say 5 to 7 years old. We will create an archive storage account. We will then move those files off the on-prem file server because they're not generally being used. We will move those into Azure. All right, so again, there would be an initial cost with transactions and operations when the files are moved, but then after that, if there's just an archive, if it's effectively a backup or a base that people can work from, the costs in operations are going to be fairly small. So again, remember that all of these are simply tools in the toolbox to help you solve individual problems, okay? Now, you can create one big storage account, you can create lots of smaller accounts. It's just a matter of what makes sense. Maybe you want one for different permissions. Maybe you want a storage account so the customer can share files externally with third parties via a simple web download or something, maybe when SharePoint isn't appropriate. But again, what you'll see here is for around 100 gig of data, again, the costs are relatively cheap. And the good thing here is we can expand and contract that as required, and we only pay for what we use, right? So again, this is based on a total of 100 gig. If you only use 1 gig the first month, you're only going to be billed for that. So again, you grow into that, that's how you will build. It's all a consumption-based billing model here. So again, keep that in mind. But if you haven't had a look at it already, certainly go in and have a look at something called Azure SMB files. It's a really handy way to map a drive to the cloud and move things like archive data. Another example that I have is that customers who take a lot of photos don't make sense generally in things like SharePoint because they can't be indexed. But if we move them into a file store like here, people can still access them via a map drive if they want. So again, we've got that option. Now, once we've moved our Exchange and we've moved some of our files, the next thing we need to consider is how do we get our users synchronized to Azure AD? So as I mentioned, we can't install the Azure AD Connect software onto our SBS server. It's just simply not supported and can cause lots of problems. So that console that we put in to do backup, we can also use that now to do our Azure AD Connect. So that member server running a more modern operating system can have the Azure AD software installed on it. That can then do the synchronization from our network. It can pull the users and the credential information from our domain controller, which is SBS, synchronize that up to Azure AD. So now we have a copy of our users in Azure AD, and they can then take advantage of the Azure resources. As I pointed out, the option here is remember that the server here, the Azure AD Connect or the member server that I have here shown as on-prem, doesn't have to be on-prem, right? We could use this as a virtual machine. Now, to do that, we're going to need to create a connectivity between the on-prem and the Azure environment. But again, remember that you can use an on-prem member server if you wish, or again, if we did the site-to-site VPN, which we're coming to first, then you can have the member server in Azure, and that probably makes more sense. So, as I mentioned, the idea here would be is you've got your stuff synchronizing. Once you've got that happening, you probably want to create a site-to-site VPN. That site-to-site VPN is going to give you connectivity between your Azure resources, your Azure infrastructure, and your on-prem environment. Effectively, it's going to make the SBS and the Azure network seem like one. They'll all be able to talk to each other. They'll all be able to see resources. You'll be able to move files. Users will be able to map drives because it's effectively one big network. Now, a couple of caveats when it comes to doing site-to-site VPNs with Azure. Again, I would suggest to you that one of the early things you need to look at in the customer's environment is, do they have an adequate router? So typically, most customers have a consumer-grade router. This generally doesn't support the IPsec that is required to do site-to-site VPNs. So you can achieve this a number of different ways. You can obviously look at upgrading their internet and maybe putting in a better firewall, a managed firewall. You could potentially use Windows routing and remote access server behind the normal consumer router and make that the termination for the VPN. So again, lots of options here. So again, if they don't want to buy a more expensive router or they don't want to invest in that for a while, there is something like a Windows server, remote routing and access server that you can service, you can set up, maybe again on that member server that you've put in that can terminate the VPN. So once we've got our VPN, again, the infrastructure on the left and on the right looks exactly the same. I would suggest to you that probably one of the first things that you should do when it comes to connecting and on an existing on-prem SBS environment to Azure is to do a site-to-site VPN, even before you do anything else. The site-to-site VPN, if we have a look at the costs here, so you'll see that a basic site-to-site VPN, the gateway, which is effectively the router in Azure, is going to set you back about $37 a month, and 100 gigs of data through that pipe is going to cost you another 15. So you're roughly about $50 a month will give you a 100 gig link between Azure and your on-prem environment. Now, the important thing to remember with Azure is that you pay for traffic out of Azure, not traffic into Azure. So if you're looking at doing a migration, you set up a site-to-site VPN, and you're copying most of the data up into Azure, then there's no cost for that inbound traffic. It's only outbound traffic that you pay for. So in this case, again, you could effectively probably look at doubling, thinking of that gigabyte limit of 100 gigs of traffic actually is 200, because again, you get 50% of your traffic there for free. So you can see that a site-to-site VPN, setting that up, so putting an Azure subscription into a Microsoft 365 environment and setting up a site-to-site VPN, apart from the setup cost, obviously is going to set you back about $50 odd a month. And that's going to give you the flexibility to say, you know what, let's run up another file server as a virtual machine in the cloud, or let's run up the third-party SQL VM in the cloud and give the third-party access to that while they're doing the migration. All right, so again, I would generally recommend that you consider doing a site-to-site VPN as one of the first infrastructure steps. And this can remain hybrid for as long as you need. And then finally, if everything moves to the cloud, you can then basically break down that site-to-site VPN, and there's no need to pay for that anymore. So again, one of the first things I'd certainly be recommending. So once we've got our site-to-site VPN, we would typically then move our third-party applications like SQL servers and so on. So we would run up a VM with SQL on it. We would migrate the app onto that. Now, the great thing about doing this in Azure is that, as we all know, third parties, when you go to them initially and say, how much RAM, how much disk space, how much power do you need for application, they will come back to you after you've gone out and bought all that hardware and say, you know what, we actually need more than we told you. Can we please get more RAM, more disk space, or whatever? Now, in Azure, that's no sweat, because basically you shut down the virtual machine in the configuration you've got, you select a more powerful machine or with more resources, you power it back up, and away you go. So upgrading hardware once it is in Azure is as simple as basically a reboot. You've got that flexibility. Now, the other good thing that we can do in Azure quite easily is we can lock the access to that virtual machine down by our ACL. So we can basically lock it down by IP address. So we can say, you know what, we're the ones maintaining it, so only our IP address plus the third-party developer are the only two that can have access to this. So remember that most of these environments generally tend to be RDP accessible, including things like SBS environments. This way we can actually easily and quickly apply security and lock it down by IP address so that only restricted users can get access to any VMs or environments that we build. If you want to, you can do the same sort of best practices that you would do on-prem. Instead of having direct access to your boxes or your VMs in Azure, you could go in and create a jump box. So again, you go in and do a RD client, and then that then allows you to back end onto the machines. You can have multiple networks. You can put firewalls between the networks in Azure. Again, anything that you can do on-prem, you can do in Azure, and you've got far more flexibility because, again, if you don't need the resources, you can break them down. If you need to test them, you spin them up, use them, and put them into production if required. So now, if we just have a look at the costing of a virtual machine, a quick basic virtual machine, remember there are lots and lots of options here, but the base I would give you is that with Azure virtual machines, you should typically underquote a machine. And the reason is, as I mentioned, is it's so easy to upgrade. So on-prem, most people have always overspec'd the machine because, oh, it's got to last 3 years, then it has to last 5 years, and maybe even 7 years. But with Azure, you can start with a really underpowered machine, monitor it, and then you can increment it as required to keep the cost down. So it gives you that flexibility. So we're going to look here at a D2 V2, again, 8 gig of RAM, so much disk space. Now you'll note here that the cost of this is about $217 a month there, and that's if you run it 24/7. You'll also notice that we have in the billing options 3 options now. We have pay-as-you-go, we have what's called reserved instances for 1 and 3 years. So now we've got even more flexibility with the way that we deploy infrastructure in virtual machines, which I'll come to where I've got some pricing there for you as well. So again, that option there for 217 is if we run it 24/7 and treat it as though it was the same hardware as it was on-prem. So again, we've moved our SQL, we can move our third-party applications, give them a VM, same sort of deal, easy to shift across. So typically we end up left with just an SBS box running as a domain controller. Now, again, as you'll notice here, what I've done is the pricing down the bottom. You'll notice that what I've done is I've said, you know what, I'm not going to run that server for the full month. I'm actually going to run that for 600 hours rather than 744. You'll see that if I can do that, then the price drops down to $180. So I'm saving a bit of money. So what is possible with Azure, because it's all a software environment, I could potentially set up a scheduled script to go in and actually shut down non-essential services and things like VMs on weekends. So again, here's the Easter holiday. Maybe we shut it down at midnight on Thursday and we power it up again midnight Monday, Tuesday morning or something. So again, you do have this flexibility. You don't have to use it, but it is there, again, especially if you want to target non-essential services. If you can do that, if you can automate it, then you can apply that. And you can see you do save a fair amount of money. Now, the other option that you can use to save money is the reserved instances. So reserved instances is basically you going to Microsoft and saying, we agree for a period of 1 or 3 years to basically continue to pay, or we have a contract for the 3-year period for this style of virtual machine. That allows Microsoft to go into its data center, reserve a machine for you, and again, basically you will use that machine for the period. Now, if you think about it, the way that typical on-prem hardware has been delivered, it has been in a 3-year cycle. So again, you could go to the customer and say, well, if you agree to go with this hardware level for 3 years or 1 year, we can give you this discount. Now, with a 3-year reserved instance, you'll see that that price drops even further. So we're now down from $215 to basically $145. So you've got a lot of flexibility here to play with once you sit down and design your network correctly. So just banging in a VM, spinning it up for 24 hours, 7 days a week, and over-speccing it just in case you need it is really not the way to go when it comes to the cloud. The way to go is all about consumption, minimizing what's the minimum I need, what are the minimum resources I need to do the job, because if I need more, it's so easy to upgrade. So again, the options for saving money on VMs are to obviously turn the machines off using an automated process, and also look at using reserved instances as another way. So now what we've got is, with our synchronization happening, we've effectively got our domain information running in something like Azure. So our users are there, but things like group policy and that, which are older constructs, again, you need to make a decision as to whether you need those going forward. So what we can do here, again, is you'll see that what I've got here is that if you need a domain controller, let's say you do still need a domain controller in your environment to support older applications or whatever, then basically what you can do is say, you know what power does just a virtual machine need? Well, basically, if it's just doing AD, it only needs a little bit of RAM and a little bit of disk just to do the AD. So as I mentioned earlier, you can break up your roles and have a domain controller VM. You can have an SQL VM. You can have a file and print server VM. You can have whatever you want and basically use that. Or another way to do it, because Azure supports nested virtualization, you can again have one larger machine, right, which is running as a VM, and inside that you can have Hyper-V guests as you did on-prem. So basically it's exactly the same with a VM host running guests, but as an Azure virtual machine. So you've got the flexibility there. Maybe you want multiple VMs to give you that redundancy, or maybe to give you the flexibility, or if you want to save costs, perhaps maybe just one server with the specs running the guests as you did on-prem. So you can price this up, you can target it to be exactly what you want. But in this case, if you just need a machine to run a domain controller, you can probably get away with it for around $25 a month to do that. Now, one of the big differences that Azure will give you, if you notice towards the top left-hand corner, is that Azure will give you a 99.9% SLA on a single VM. Now, that single VM has to be running premium storage to provide that, so basically SSD drives, so they can do quick swapping. But you're never going to get an SLA for a single virtual machine on-prem or in a virtual environment, generally with other providers. So Microsoft, provided you use premium storage, will give you uptime guarantee of 99.9% on your virtual machine there, again, inside Azure. Now, other protection methods you can use, again, the idea of availability sets. So that's having two servers, making sure they aren't in the same rack. You can have, again, the availability zone. So you can split the machines and have the multiple servers in different zones. And then you can even go to multi-region if you want. So it can scale up. The big thing here is we can go from an SLA of one machine to multiple machines, to multiple zones, and to multiple geolocations. Now, my challenge to you would then be is, why do you need a domain controller, right? What function and role does a domain controller provide for you? Okay, if you do need a domain controller to do Kerberos, to do NTLM, to do old world style authentication, then Microsoft has a platform as a service option for you. It's called Azure AD Domain Services. Basically, for a fee of around $150 a month, this is effectively a domain server as a service. So Microsoft looks after the hardware, it provisions it, it provides it, it makes sure it's globally available, backed up, redundant, and all you do is access it via software. You don't have to worry about it. It's not a virtual machine. Microsoft manages the virtual machine. You just pay for a service. All right, so again, Azure AD Domain Services connected to your Azure AD is going to give you the ability to have a domain controller without the need to have physical hardware or to have it in a VM as well. Okay, so let's see if we can go down. Have I lost control here? Let's see. Can we go to the next slide, please? Okay, so the thing to think about here is, again, when you're designing your solutions here is, what do you need an on-prem domain controller to do, or what role does it perform today? What do you need Azure AD to do? So Azure AD, again, has a range of different things that it does. It doesn't allow Windows 7 and 8 machine joins. It does allow Windows 10, but it will also allow you to join mobile devices and do Office 365, all right? So again, if you need things like LDAP, certificate services, organizational units, Kerberos, then you can definitely add something like Azure AD Domain Services to Azure AD to perform those older functions. But my question to you is, really in this day and age, do you really need some of those old world functions? If you don't, well, then again, you can eliminate that and just use Azure AD. That comes with, again, Office 365, Microsoft 365 out of the box. Next slide, please. So eventually, if we do use Azure AD Domain Services or run a VM as a domain controller in the cloud, we should be able to have a site-to-site VPN connected to our environment, and we should then be able to move, next slide, moves everything into the cloud. And again, like I said, that on-prem console that was there for doing backups, again, you can eliminate that, you could move it to a VM in the cloud, and so on. So I believe it is certainly possible to move the environment with a number of options that are available to you. You can choose which one suits your needs the best, which works the best for you. But again, it's a matter of moving the stuff across. My advice generally would be is to look at a site-to-site VPN as the first option, move the obvious stuff like Exchange, SharePoint, and those files, and then take advantage of things like Azure files basically from there. So in summary, evaluate what's there and what direction they want to go. Look at enabling your Office 365 and Azure together, so putting a paid Azure subscription in there. Look at your Azure file backup options in the file application, and especially site-to-site recovery. It's much easier than it may appear. Look at doing the Azure AD Connect, the synchronization. Remember, we can't put that software on SBS by default, so we need another server to fill that. Migrate your emails, your company web, and those initial files, which would go to SharePoint and OneDrive. Look at a site-to-site VPN to allow the infrastructure to be viewable in both sides of the fence, and then migrate your remaining files, your third-party apps, eliminate any local RDS. So the way we can eliminate RDS these days also is to start looking at moving towards this Windows Virtual Desktop, currently in preview, but expected to be GA shortly. So again, Windows Virtual Desktop in Azure is basically RDS as a service, so platform as a service again. And at the end of the day, we can then eliminate the SBS, turn it off once we've moved the domain and swung all that stuff across. And then that's not the end of it. The revenue opportunities continue, allowing you to implement things like EMS. So you can go in there and do enhanced security. You can do Azure AD P1, conditional access, be more deeper dive on the identities, managing devices, and so on. So don't think the migration from on-prem to the cloud is the end of it. There's lots more that can continue on and enable after that. So some best practices for you. All partners who have Action Pack or better basically have access to internal use rights, Azure and Office 365. Use those, try some of this stuff out, understand things like site-to-site VPNs before you go and implement it. Again, understand how to use the Azure Resource Manager. The great thing about that is you can script so much of it now with PowerShell and JSON and so on. That means that once you've done it right, you can then apply that in other locations to get consistency and also save you time. Look at ExpressRoute if you need faster connectivity. ExpressRoute has come down quite dramatically in price of late. And as I mentioned, think of hybrid as the way to go when it goes to migrations like this, especially this is a very complex migration with the complexity mainly being around the limitations of SBS. And there's no better time than to start now. These SBS boxes are not getting any younger. They're becoming more risk, and I certainly wouldn't want to be taking on that risk on behalf of a customer, so make sure that you do know that. So with that, I will hand back to you and allow you to continue on.
Yeah, thanks, Rob. Thanks for the presentation. And as I had mentioned in the beginning of the webinar, if you guys have any questions, and I think since Rob mentioned that, there's so many different scenarios and so many different ways of completing this migration, you can email all of your questions to me and Ashna, and then we can work individually with each one of you to come back to you and help you understand this migration process in a better way. Now, what I have to talk about today from Ingram Micro perspective is to talk about our partner enablement, partner recruitment, and demand generation program around Microsoft Azure, which is called as the Azure Accelerate program. So this is a global program that we have available now from the last 4 to 5 months here in Australia. We have got about more than 30+ partners on board this program. So what this program has to offer, if I can just take you to the next slide, is that we are actually helping you to build a competency on Azure. We are helping you to do some proactive customer demand generation on Azure with the help of some of the marketing kits that we have available. Once you onboard the program, for you to help to help you train your sales guys to be having those conversations with the end customers, to help them explain the Azure value proposition, the Azure migration value proposition. And one of the very interesting campaigns that we have today available is the SQL Server and the Windows Server are to 2008 end of support. So we have got a pre-designed marketing campaign kit around that proposition as well. So you can take use of those campaign kits in terms of, we have got presentations, we have got selling guides, we have got emailers which you can use up to help train your sales guys to help having those better conversations with your end customers. Very importantly, we have got something called as Azure Center of Excellence. So that's a team of about 20 people that we have today, where we offer you Azure Lifecycle Services. So right from the time that you discover an Azure opportunity, and you're talking about discovery and assessment of the workloads to go into Azure, you're talking about the actual architecture and design of a solution into Azure, then doing a proof of concept, and then finally actually the migration of those workloads into Azure. You can now procure all of those services from Ingram Micro. We have this services package as a part of our offering, and you can have a look at that pricing also available from our cloud marketplace platform as well. Of course, then you get some professional pricing once you onboard the program and you reach up to a certain level of Azure spend with Ingram Micro. You get access to professional pricing, which is additional in terms of what you're making with Ingram Micro as a front-end margin today. We help you with doing competency builds. So we help you with completing your Azure certifications. We give you certain credits, dollar credits to help your technical people to clear the examinations, to help them get certified on Azure and become more confident in their conversations with the end customers when they talk about Azure. And then, of course, you get the elite partner treatment. Depending on what partner tier you are, you get a dedicated salesperson and a dedicated account manager from Ingram Micro as a part of your relationship with us, and it makes it, an end-to-end proposition from Ingram Micro's perspective when you are starting to build your competency and generate some proactive demand on Azure. Yeah, I'm just trying to rush through this, but I think you will get a copy of these slides at the end of the presentation, so you can come back to me and drop with any kind of questions you have, as I've said before. So just a brief on the benefits depending on the partner tier you have. So we currently have 3 partner tiers: fundamentals, develop, and elite. So elite is something that you would probably want to get to, maybe in the next 5 to 6 months, where we're talking about 20K per month of Azure spend through our marketplace, and these numbers are actually USD numbers. Yep. Sorry about that. I think we have got some questions in here, which probably I think we'll take those questions later, as I mentioned before. So yeah, and then you can see that we give you these exclusive promotions. You're eligible for getting some additional discounts from Ingram Micro on top of your front-end margin with us. We give you support towards certification, and then you have got a dedicated Azure team supporting in your Ingram Micro relationship, in form of me, and then we have got John Rowe as our account manager, and we have got dedicated people in pre-sales as well. Going ahead, I would like to talk a bit about lifecycle services. As I mentioned, so these lifecycle services are there in each and every step of your Azure sales lifecycle and every step of your conversation with your end customer. So if you don't have these capabilities in-house, or if you are not currently have these resources in-house to have these conversations and deliver these services to your end customers, you can actually come and talk to Ingram Micro. We can help you deliver these services to your end customers. Very specifically in the context of today's webinar, you can come and procure these SBS to Azure migration services from Ingram Micro. We can help you in that throughout in that end-to-end journey. So you have got list pricing available from our cloud marketplace, but we can always talk about a custom built pricing for our resellers, depending on how big that opportunity is. So you can have come and approach us and have that conversation with us, and we can help you with that as well. Going ahead, these are some of the promotions that we are running till the end of June this year. So any new tenant that you spun up on our cloud marketplace and you reach the consumption to $300 during the promotion period, you get $300 cash back. Similarly, if you have got any of the existing tenants on our marketplace and they touch the consumption of about $1,000 a month or $2,000 a month, you can get $2,000 cash back from us. One thing to note here is that the maximum cash back that you can receive is up to $2,000. So yeah, and then the combination of the existing tenants and the new tenants, the maximum cash back that you can get from us till the end of June this year is going to be $2,000. And then the last slide is around a very special offer going on for SQL Server 2008 R2 end of support. So we are actually offering free migration services for any of your customers who are sitting in the older version of SQL Server to move to the latest version. And there's a catch here. It's not about latest version on-prem, but it's actually moving those workloads into Microsoft Azure, and we can offer you free lifecycle services around those particular opportunities. And then, of course, when you move your workloads to Azure, you get 3 years worth of free security updates as a courtesy of moving to the Azure platform. We give you free tool, free cloud cost optimization tool called as Cloud Checker, which can actually help your end customers to really understand their Azure spend and helping them with alerts and cost optimization as they move on. So we are actually officially launching this tool in the market next week after Easter, and as a promotion, we'll be giving this tool for free to our resellers who are procuring Azure from our marketplace as of now. And then, of course, so all the qualifying consumption as a part of this migration, you will get 10% cashback or cloud marketplace credit, which you can actually use to procure more Azure from Ingram Micro Cloud Marketplace. As I said, I'm trying to rush through these slides, so you'll get a copy of these slides, so you can go through these promotions. And if you have any questions, you can get back to us on this email ID, which is imcloudau@ingrammicro.com, or you can send me an email as well, because I'll be reaching out to all the participants today and giving them my contact information, so you can come back and have these conversations to me with regards to the free migration services or with regards to any of the promotions that we're running till the end of June. And we'll also be sending you a link of today's recording. So this webinar was being recorded. So, all the stuff from Robert Crane and all the stuff from Ingram Micro, you can come back to us and you can go through the recording and have any questions, please come back to us. And as I mentioned in the beginning of the webinar, I'm sure you guys will be having a lot of questions, because Robert covered a lot of stuff and talked about a lot of different scenarios. So I'm sure you will be having a lot of questions, but since we have got this time constraint to squeeze this webinar into 1 hour, we are not in a position to take the questions online. So just send us all the questions offline and we'll go from there. And I'll make sure that I come back to each and every questioner and resolve those questions and any other queries you have as you begin on your SPS to Azure migration journey. Once again, thanks for your time joining us. Thanks for your time for joining us this afternoon today. I think we had an overwhelming attendance from all the participants, and we'll be in touch with all of you soon in terms of any of your questions and queries. Wishing you a very good evening and a very happy Easter in advance, and we'll talk to all of you very soon. Thank you very much.